There are places that never issue orders. No treaties are signed. No declarations of war are made. But from within their stillness, history takes a turn. On a hill overlooking the Thames, Cliveden House stands, beautiful, discreet, and seemingly harmless. Not an official center of power, but it is where the most important decisions are not made. In those opulent rooms, peace was spoken of more than war. Caution was praised more than action, and silence was seen as the moral choice. But history doesn't ask us what we want. It only records the price of what has been delayed. This is the story of Cliveden House, and the hidden price when politics and nobility clash. On a tranquil bend of the Thames, where morning mist settles on perfectly manicured lawns and the boundary between nature and power seems blurred, Cliveden House stands not as a mere monument, but as a structure born to observe, to conceal, and to outlast the people who pass through its grand halls. From its very foundations laid in the mid-17th century, Cliveden was not built simply to live in. It was created to look down upon the world below, both geographically and symbolically, as a high point where power could reside without having to speak for itself. The first house here was built in 1666 for George Villiers, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, a figure typical of an era where political power and personal life were inextricably intertwined. Villiers was a close friend and rumored lover of King Charles II, and Cliveden was born during a time when the English court was still recovering from the Civil War, where loyalty and betrayal could be decided in opulent drawing rooms, no less so on the battlefield. From that moment, Cliveden carried a special destiny. It was not merely a residence of the nobility, but a mediating space where private conversations could have public consequences. For the next 3 centuries, Cliveden was repeatedly burned, rebuilt, and changed owners. But each time it was reborn, it became larger, more discreet, and more closely intertwined with the highest echelons of British power. The version of Cliveden that the world knows today is largely the result of a mid-19th century reconstruction, when William Waldorf Astor, one of the wealthiest men of his time, acquired the estate and transformed it into a symbol of the intersection between new wealth and old aristocracy. For Astor, Cliveden was more than just a country villa. It was a statement. Money could buy stone, columns, paintings, and gardens, but what Astor truly sought was legitimacy, the ability to enter the political and social world of Great Britain not as an outsider, but as part of an established power structure. It was here that Cliveden began to become more than a house. It became a stage. Not a public stage with lights and an audience, but a stage for dinner parties, extended weekends, where politicians, diplomats, high-ranking military officers, and leading intellectuals met in the seemingly harmless atmosphere of elegance. The Italian-style gardens, the stone steps overlooking the River Thames, the wood-paneled living rooms adorned with classical paintings all contribute to a sense of security, privacy, and transcendence from the turmoil of London politics. But it is precisely this privacy that makes Cliveden so dangerous. In modern political history, decisions of great significance are rarely made in noisy halls. They often arise in enclosed spaces where those in power feel unsupervised, where words are not recorded and memories can be manipulated. Cliveden, with its secluded yet not so distant location from the center of power, became one such place. It wasn't until the early 20th century, when the Astor family bequeathed Cliveden to their son, Waldorf Astor, and his wife, Nancy Astor, that the house's political role truly took shape. Nancy Astor was more than just the mistress of Cliveden. She was the first woman to sit in the British House of Commons, a symbol of social change, but also the center of a sophisticated network of elite connections. Under her leadership, Cliveden became a regular meeting point for a group of figures who profoundly influenced British domestic and foreign policy in the interwar period. The press later dubbed them the Cliveden Group, a term both vague and suggestive. There was no official membership list, no charter or meeting minutes, but one fact was undeniable. Those who frequented Cliveden were capable of shaping public opinion, influencing policy, and shaping the course of an entire nation. In a Europe sliding toward war, with the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy, And with the lingering fear of a new conflict still haunting the minds of World War I survivors, Cliveden became a place where dangerous ideas could be discussed without public challenge. What complicates the story of Cliveden is not the meeting of powerful individuals, but how this space allowed them to believe they were acting in the common good, while in reality being driven by background, privilege, and the fear of loss. For many in the British aristocracy of the time, war was not merely a humanitarian catastrophe, but a direct threat to the social order that had nurtured them. In the drawing rooms of Cliveden, peace was not simply a moral ideal, it was a strategy to protect a world on the brink of collapse. However, history is rarely tolerant of such spaces, for when decisions are made in the shadows, the price paid is often not borne by those seated in the room. Cliveden, with its serene beauty and impeccable architecture, began to accumulate an invisible legacy: delayed choices, ignored warnings, and compromises disguised as prudence. These left no mark on stone or wood, but they are etched into the political history of England. The first part of the Cliveden story is not an overt tragedy, but a slow accumulation. A house built to overlook a river gradually became a place to look down upon the destiny of an entire nation. And in that elegant silence, a question began to form, though unspoken. Could power, when wrapped in beauty and tradition, become more dangerous than its own overt brutality? If part 1 tells the story of how Cliveden House came into being and why it gradually became a space of power, part 2 is where that power begins to operate in its true nature. Quiet, informal, without voting, believing consequences far beyond the scope of a house or a family. Here, history is not written in signed documents, but in conversations that last through dinner, in seemingly harmless weekends, and in the sense of consensus formed among people who share the same background, the same fears, and the same belief that they understand the world better than the rest. From the 1920 seconds onwards, Cliveden entered its most politically active period, even though on paper it remained just a country villa. World War I had only recently ended, and Britain was living in a state of profound weariness. Nearly 1 million Britons had died, a generation of young men had been wiped out, and the belief that the empire was invincible was beginning to crumble. In this context, the British elite no longer thought of power in the old way. They no longer believed that absolute military might or territorial expansion would guarantee the future. Instead, they sought stability, even immobility, as a way to avoid a repeat of the catastrophe. This very mentality shaped the atmosphere at Cliveden throughout the interwar period. The regular visitors were not warmongers or extremists in the outward sense. On the contrary, they were often people who considered themselves moderate, rational, and responsible. They believed the world had paid too high a price for hasty decisions, and that their role as educated, wealthy, and well-connected individuals was to prevent another catastrophe at all costs. But it was precisely this moral belief that became the most dangerous blind spot. At Cliveden, discussions rarely included the voices of those outside their social class. Workers, veterans, colonial subjects, or even politicians representing the poorer regions of Britain were almost entirely absent. Instead, the house was filled with MPs, journalists, diplomats, and senior military personnel, all accustomed to a top-down world. Within this space, an unspoken consensus formed, not because everyone was exactly alike, but because they shared a common frame of reference. They all believed that the old European order, however flawed, was better than any radical change. They all feared that instability on the continent, particularly the rise of extremist movements, would spill over into Britain and shake the very foundations of their society. And above all, they shared the belief that people like themselves, not the crowd or the media, were the ones with the common sense to make the right decisions. It was at Cliveden that the concept of influence began to transcend the traditional concept of power. No one here enacted laws. No one signed treaties, but the ideas exchanged at Cliveden gradually seeped into newspaper articles, parliamentary speeches, and cabinet discussions. An opinion repeated enough times in this safe space would become self-evident, and when it appeared in public, it was no longer seen as a personal opinion, but as the voice of reason. The role of the press in this process is noteworthy. Several influential journalists of the time frequented Cliveden, not just as guests, but as part of a social circle. Dinners and intimate conversations created a special relationship where the lines between observation and participation blurred. When these journalists wrote about European politics, about a rapidly changing Germany, or about the need to understand the other side, their tone reflected not only personal observation, but also the prevailing atmosphere of consensus that had formed at Cliveden. From the outside, Cliveden maintained its neutrality and elegance. There were no political banners, no public speeches, no signs that it was a center of power, but it was precisely this invisibility that made it effective. Because when power doesn't need to proclaim itself, it is less questioned. When decisions are presented as the natural outcome of collective reason, one rarely asks who was in the room when those decisions were made. Part 2 of the Cliveden story, therefore, is not a series of specific events, but the formation of a mindset. A mindset that peace could be achieved through concessions, that threats could be contained through understanding, and that history could be slowed down long enough to avoid another shock. In the context of Britain still bearing the wounds of World War I, these beliefs sounded humane and reasonable. But history rarely judges intentions, only consequences. And as the world moved closer to the brink of another war, Cliveden began to bear a heavier question than ever before. Was caution stemming from fear any different from blindness disguised by moralistic language? Could a space designed to protect the stability of the elite inadvertently contribute to weakening a nation's ability to respond to growing threats beyond its grasp? These questions had no clear answers at this stage, but they began to linger in the air of Cliveden. Even as the parties continued, the wine was still poured, and conversations flowed with familiar confidence. For sometimes, history is not changed by a dramatic moment, but by the persistence of false assumptions, repeated long enough in closed rooms. As the 1,930 seconds approached, the atmosphere at Cliveden began to change in ways barely discernible from the outside. Parties continued with familiar formalities. Strolls through the gardens under the ancient trees overlooking the Thames persisted, and conversations retained the refined manners of the British upper class. But beneath this apparent continuity, a different world was moving faster, more violently, and far more dangerously than Cliveden was willing to acknowledge. Europe was no longer a continent recovering from war, but a space of instability, where old political structures were challenged by new, bold, and undisguisedly ambitious forces. In Germany, the fledgling Weimar Republic was collapsing under the pressure of deeply wounded economic, social, and psychological pressure. Inflation, unemployment, and the humiliation following the Treaty of Versailles created an ideal environment for simple yet extreme promises. When Adolf Hitler became chancellor in 1933, many in Britain saw not a future dictator, but a populist politician, an overreaction but controllable response to chaos. At Cliveden, these developments were not completely ignored. On the contrary, they were closely monitored, but through a special lens. Cliveden's guests did not view Germany from the perspective of future victims or from the perspective of small nations fearing being swallowed up. They viewed it from the perspective of order. A strong Germany, in that sense, could be a bulwark against Bolshevism from the Soviet Union, another major obsession of the British elite at the time. In conversations at Cliveden, the communist threat was often mentioned with far more anxiety than the burgeoning fascism in Berlin. This preference created a dangerous chain of reasoning. If communism was seen as an existential threat to social order and private property, then any force opposing it, by whatever means, could be seen as a potential partner, or at least a negotiable issue. At Cliveden, this wasn't explicitly stated as doctrine, but it existed as an implicit assumption, shared widely enough to be unnecessary. At the same time, Britain was facing serious internal problems. The Great Depression had brought about economic decline, rising unemployment, and shaken confidence in the political system. The government had to balance pressure to rearm with strong public opposition to any sign of an impending new war. The memories of the trenches, of the endless death tolls, and of a lost generation were still too fresh to be ignored. In this context, Cliveden became a stronghold for a growing belief among those in power. that time was on their side, that if Britain could delay conflict long enough, Europe's problems would resolve themselves or at least become clearer. This delay was not seen as cowardly, but as wise. It was encapsulated in the language of moral responsibility and historical prudence. But this prudence had a serious blind spot. It assumed that opponents shared the same logic, the same fears, and the same moral limitations. At Cliveden, many believed that Hitler, despite his aggressive rhetoric, would ultimately act like a traditional European politician, bound by national interests and international pressure. This belief doesn't stem from naivety, but from their own historical experience, as they grew up in a world where wars between great powers often ended in negotiation and compromise. The difference lies in the fact that the world they understood was gradually disappearing. Fascism did not operate according to the unspoken rules of 19th century aristocratic diplomacy. It sought not balance, but dominance. But at Cliveden, this fundamental change occurred too slowly to be clearly perceived. Each German action was considered in isolation, each step explained as a rational response to previous injustices. And as each step normalized, the overall picture became harder to see than ever before. The setting of Cliveden contributed significantly to this process. Its physical isolation from impoverished industrial centers, from the populations directly affected by the crisis, and from the emerging refugee communities in Europe, deprived discussions there of a sense of urgency. When an issue is discussed in the warmth of a living room, among people sharing a common cultural and social background, it's more likely to become a theoretical problem than an unfolding catastrophe. Part 3 of the Cliveden story is therefore a story of the disconnect between perception and reality. As Europe moves toward increasing extremism, Cliveden continues to operate on the rhythm of an old world, where polite words and good intentions are considered sufficient to control the future. Cliveden's silence is not a lack of concern, but a choice of non-confrontation, a choice reinforced by the belief that confrontation will lead to worse consequences. But history doesn't stand still waiting for such spaces to catch up. As dictatorships consolidate power, as treaties are broken, and as the language of violence gradually replaces the language of diplomacy, the assumptions nurtured at Cliveden begin to falter. And in that fragility, an increasingly clear question emerged. Could silence, even if driven by the fear of war, become a form of complicity? That question had not yet erupted at this stage. It remained veiled by social rituals and a belief in control, but the groundwork for a larger clash had been laid. Cliveden, from a place observing history, was gradually becoming a part of history itself, a part it could no longer stand outside. By the mid-1930s, what had once been merely cautious assumptions at Cliveden began to be challenged by events that could no longer be interpreted as harmless. Europe was not merely shifting, it was accelerating. Nazi Germany's moves no longer resembled post-Versailles adjustments, but revealed an ambition to restructure the continental order by force. And it was during this period that the tension between the worldview nurtured at Cliveden House and the external political reality became increasingly difficult to conceal. In 1935, Germany's open rearmament and the introduction of compulsory military service broke the core constraints of the Treaty of Versailles. For many in Europe, this was a clear warning sign. But in conversations at Cliveden, the reaction remained more analytical than outraged. Berlin's actions were seen as an almost inevitable step for a nation that had been militarily stifled. The familiar argument resurfaced. If Germany were treated more fairly, if its legitimate grievances were acknowledged, then the European order could be stabilized without conflict. It is here that the gap between morality and strategy begins to dangerously blur. The theoretical acknowledgement of injustices in the international order gradually slips into acceptance of unilateral actions to correct them. And as each such action is seen as a legitimate exception, the capacity for collective response among democratic powers is eroded little by little. The atmosphere at Cliveden during these years was therefore quietly tense. Guests still came, but conversations were no longer entirely lighthearted. News from Europe appeared more frequently in the evenings, and questions that had previously been avoided began to be raised, albeit within the safe limits of politeness. Would Hitler really stop? Would concessions be enough to satisfy the ambitions of a regime building its power on mass mobilization and nationalistic myths? However, each time that question approaches a disturbing conclusion, it is pulled back by the collective memory of World War I. For the generation sitting in Cliveden's living rooms, war is not an abstract concept. It is personal memory, family loss, an unceasing obsession. It is this memory that creates a powerful psychological barrier, making any solution that avoids armed conflict attractive, even if the cost of such avoidance is ever higher. In this context, Germany's reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936 became a crucial turning point. This was no longer a matter of interpreting the treaty, but a direct military action challenging the European security order. The weak response from Britain and France, justified by a desire to avoid escalation, sent an irreversible signal. And at Cliveden, this event caused an unusual silence, not because of a lack of information, but because old assumptions were beginning to falter with the new reality. Some within the Cliveden circle began to realize the danger of the path they were taking. But individual awareness doesn't easily translate into collective action, especially in an environment where consensus has become the norm. Expressing dissenting opinions meant challenging not only the argument, but also social relationships, prestige, and a sense of belonging to an elite community. And so, doubts were often kept to themselves, or only expressed as incomplete questions. Part 4 of the Cliveden story thus marks the first crack in the thought structure that had existed for over a decade. External events could no longer be fully explained by the language of caution. But Cliveden was not yet ready to abandon his belief that control was possible. This hesitation stemmed not from malice or naivety, but from a deep attachment to a worldview that was slowly slipping into the past. As the parties ended and the guests departed, Cliveden stood there, silent and unchanging. But within the stone walls, something had changed. No longer was there absolute confidence in his ability to navigate history, but a vague feeling that history was beginning to spiral out of control. And in the space between awareness and action, Cliveden's hidden price began to become clearer than ever. As the late 1930 seconds approached, what had once been called prudence at Cliveden began to take on a different meaning. No longer a moral restraint or a strategic consideration to avoid conflict, it gradually became a psychological and political burden, with consequences that no one in those elegant drawing rooms could deny. The outside world no longer operated to the slow pace of discreet conversations, and each passing day brought new evidence that old assumptions were crumbling. In 1938, the Sudetenland crisis and the Munich Agreement marked the culmination of years of conciliatory thinking. When Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich with a promise of peace for our time, the reaction in British society was one of both hope and skepticism. But at Cliveden House, the prevailing feeling was one of relief. For many in this circle, Munich was more than just a diplomatic agreement. It was confirmation that the path they had long advocated had finally been formalized at the highest levels of government. That relief, however, came with a psychological price that was difficult to immediately recognize. Because when a policy is successfully justified publicly, it also becomes harder to question from within. Voices of doubt, already weak, were now even harder to voice in an atmosphere of temporary victory. At Cliveden, the meetings following Munich took on an unusual tone. Less debate, more affirmations, as if everyone were trying to convince themselves that they had chosen correctly. But history did not allow that self-convincing to last. Just a few months later, Germany's annexation of Czechoslovakia shattered the illusion that Munich was the final destination. This was no longer a matter of protecting the German minority or rectifying the injustices of Versailles. It was an expansion of territory by force, undisguised and uncompromising. For those who had once believed Hitler could be bound by agreement, this was a painful awakening. At Cliveden, the reaction to this event was no longer purely rational. A profound sense of unease began to spread. Arguments that had been repeated for years now seemed empty, not because they were fundamentally wrong from the start, but because the world had changed faster than their ability to adapt. Caution, once considered a noble virtue, was now seen as a dangerous form of procrastination. It is noteworthy that during this period, Cliveden no longer played the central role of intellectual confidence as before. It became a reflection of internal divisions. Some began to admit, albeit privately, that they had underestimated the nature of fascism. Others clung to the belief that time, though it had betrayed them once, would ultimately side with reason. This difference didn't lead to open confrontation, but it created a heavy atmosphere where every conversation carried the feeling of unspoken things. Meanwhile, Britain began to change in ways that Cliveden could no longer control. Rearmament measures were intensified, public opinion shifted from a desire to avoid war to an acceptance that conflict might be inevitable. Important decisions were now made in a state of urgency, with no time for lengthy weekend discussions. The power of informal spaces like Cliveden, which relied on slowness and indirect influence, began to wane. Part 5 of the Cliveden story is therefore a story of the decline of a worldview. It wasn't that the people there lacked intelligence or goodwill, but rather that they were too deeply attached to a way of thinking shaped by a different historical context. When circumstances changed, that way was no longer sufficient to cope with the new reality, but abandoning it would mean admitting a mistake with far-reaching consequences. The hidden price Cliveden paid during this period lay not in a single decision, but in the cumulative delays over many years. Each choice to delay, each prioritizing stability over justice, each belief that the other side would act according to familiar rules, all combined to create a time vacuum that history would never recover. And when war finally became inevitable, Cliveden faced an unacceptably harsh truth, that its influence once so great was now insufficient to alter the course of events. The house still stood there, majestic and silent, but its role had changed. From a place that shaped political thinking, Cliveden gradually became a controversial symbol, a place people looked back to for answers to a nagging question. Can prolonged caution have consequences just as serious as recklessness? In September 1939, when Britain officially declared war on Germany, all the assumptions that had been nurtured for nearly 2 decades at Cliveden House crumbled at once, not with a loud bang, but with an indescribable emptiness. War was no longer a possibility to be avoided at all costs, but an irreversible reality. The arguments that had dominated the quiet drawing rooms now lost their context, for history had moved beyond the debate phase and into the phase of forced action. The outbreak of war brought no relief to those who had cautiously advocated it. On the contrary, it carried a heavy moral burden. For when the conflict finally broke out, the question was no longer whether war could have been avoided, but whether it could have been better prepared for, dealt with earlier, and the damage minimized. These questions weren't raised in official speeches, but they silently haunted those who had believed time was an ally. At Cliveden, the pace of life changed rapidly. Parties became less frequent, then disappeared. The long weekends of the elite were no longer suitable for a nation entering a state of totalitarianism. Spaces once designed to create a sense of separation and control now felt alien, like a relic of a world that had just ended. The house wasn't abandoned, but its social role had shrunk considerably. It was no longer a place that shaped political thought, but a symbol awaiting reassessment. In the early months of the war, Britain faced the harsh reality that the delay had not been used as effectively as they had believed. The army wasn't as prepared as it needed to be, and society was still adjusting to a war many had hoped would never happen. The hasty decisions, made in a context of limited options, reflected the true cost of prolonged delays. And while no one at Cliveden directly commanded the military campaigns, the indirect influence of the mindset nurtured there cannot be entirely denied. What complicates Cliveden's legacy during wartime is not that it caused the war, but how it represented a class that attempted to manipulate history through restraint in an era that no longer allowed it. As war spread across Europe, what had once been considered wise was now reevaluated by the measure of consequences. Small nations were swallowed up, communities were wiped out, and ultimately a global conflict raised questions about the collective responsibility of those who could have acted sooner. Within the British elite itself, the perception of Cliveden began to shift. The press and public opinion, which had previously only vaguely alluded to the Cliveden group, now looked back on the pre-war period with a more critical eye. The discreet discussions once protected by social etiquette were now scrutinized as manifestations of a dangerous detachment from popular reality. Cliveden, from a place of invisible influence, became a controversial symbol of the moral limits of unelected power. However, history is not simply an indictment. Part 6 of the Cliveden story also serves as a reminder that the people who gathered there were not traitors or conspirators in the crudest sense. They were products of their time, shaped by war memories, by a belief in order, and by a fear that the world could descend into chaos if the old forces completely collapsed. Their failure lay not in intention, but in a misjudgment of the nature of an emerging era. As the war dragged on and the level of destruction far exceeded all expectations, Cliveden gradually receded from the center of the narrative. It was no longer the place where history was being written, but a place where history was being reminisced, sometimes with regret, sometimes with criticism. The stone walls remained, but their meaning had changed. They no longer represented control or strategic vision, but became witnesses to the limits of elite influence in a world democratizing pain and sacrifice. Part 6 concludes with a bitter paradox. Cliveden, built to endure and to stand above the flow of history, survived the war as a physical structure, but the mindset that had once made it a center of influence did not. The post-1939 world no longer had room for spaces that believed history could be slowed down by courtesy. And in that fading away, Cliveden's hidden price becomes clearer than ever. When power is delayed for too long, history will take over without anyone's permission. As the guns fell silent and World War II ended, Britain entered a period where victory did not equate to complete relief. It was a society materially exhausted, spiritually wounded, and grappling with fundamental questions about itself. Who was right? Who was wrong? And what meaning did the old power structures still hold in a world radically altered? In this context, Cliveden House ceased to be a place where political influence operated silently, becoming the object of scrutiny, sometimes cold, sometimes harsh. The post-war period offered Cliveden no clear opportunity for redemption, for history rarely allows symbolic spaces to justify themselves. Instead, it placed Cliveden in a difficult position, not guilty enough to be condemned, but not innocent enough to be easily forgiven. In the collective memory that emerged after 1945, Cliveden was associated with a period when Britain chose restraint when the world needed vigilance, prioritizing social stability as the international order crumbled. The fundamental change in the post-war era was the political and social context upon which Cliveden had depended. The 1945 general election brought a Labour government to power with a sweeping reform program, laying the groundwork for a welfare state and redefining the relationship between citizens and power. In this new world, the informal influence of aristocratic families, maintained through social connections and private spaces, was seen as outdated, even suspicious. Power was now expected to be more transparent, more accountable, and linked to democratic delegation. Cliveden, with its history of secret meetings and unchecked influence, became a convenient symbol of what post-war society sought to transcend. The press, academics, and the public began to look back at the interwar period with a critical eye, not only to find the causes of the disaster, but also to identify the mindsets that made it possible. In these analyses, Cliveden often appears as a prime example of the disconnect between the elite and the rapidly changing reality. However, this reassessment was not one-sided. Some voices called for historical justice, emphasizing that those who had gathered at Cliveden acted in a context haunted by wartime memories and with a genuine desire to avoid further bloodshed. From this perspective, Cliveden was not the cause of the disaster, but a symptom of a society attempting to cope with fear using the tools of a bygone era. This debate reflected a broader tension in post-war British society, between the need for accountability and the need for understanding. For Cliveden itself, the post-war period brought about a quiet but decisive transformation. It was no longer seen primarily as a political space, but gradually as a cultural and architectural heritage, a part of the past that needed to be preserved, but also interpreted carefully. This shift reflected a broader trend, where many symbols of former power were depoliticized by placing them in the realm of heritage, where they could be admired without directly participating in current power life. But this depoliticization did not erase the memory. On the contrary, it posed a new challenge: how to tell the story of Cliveden honestly without turning it into a mere defense or indictment. In the rooms that once echoed with discreet debates, now the question of later generations resounded: can unelected power, even if driven by good intentions, impose its own moral limits? Part 7 of the Cliveden story is therefore not the conclusion, but a period of reflection, where history is restructured in social memory. The war is over, but the questions it raises are not. Cliveden exists in a state of duality, both a beautiful structure and an unsettling reminder of what happens when influence goes beyond public scrutiny. It no longer determines the future, but it forces the future to look back at the past. In the post-war world, where belief in progress is tied to transparency and accountability, Cliveden stands as a testament to a bygone era, not to be forgotten, but to be reread, slowly and seriously. For only by understanding how spaces like Cliveden operated can one hope to avoid repeating mistakes made not out of malice, but out of a prolonged confidence in outdated assumptions. Entering the latter half of the 20th century, Cliveden House entered a phase of existence distinctly different from any previous period. While during wartime it was a space marginalized from the center of power, in the long period of peace it became an object requiring interpretation. No one questioned how Cliveden would influence politics anymore. The question now was how Cliveden should be understood, and who had the right to define its significance in the national memory. This process was not a simple administrative decision, but a decades-long shift in thinking. As Cliveden gradually entered the realm of heritage preservation, the language used to describe it also changed. Its architecture, landscape, art history, and the social life of its owners were successively prioritized. The terrace gardens overlooking the River Thames were celebrated as aesthetic achievements. The opulent drawing rooms were described as testaments to the craftsmanship and taste of the British elite. In this narrative, Cliveden becomes a beautiful, almost neutral legacy, where the past is safely framed within aesthetics and nostalgia. But Cliveden's political memory is not easily obscured. For historians and those interested in the history of power, separating Cliveden from its pre-war role would be a dangerous simplification. For if Cliveden is viewed merely as an architectural structure or a cultural symbol, the uncomfortable lesson it carries is diminished. And it is here that the tension between preservation and interpretation begins to surface. In academic debates from the 1960 seconds onwards, Cliveden has often been cited as a prime example of how informal power operates in a democratic society. Not through decrees or coercion, but through intimacy, mutual trust among those of the same social standing, and the ability to shape public opinion through networks of relationships. The inclusion of Cliveden in the heritage space thus raises a sensitive question. Does preserving such a place inadvertently normalize the power structures that contributed to historical mistakes? This question has no easy answer. For many, Cliveden represents the complexity of British history, where beauty and danger can coexist in one space. Concealing either aspect would impoverish future generations' understanding. Therefore, the emerging approach is not to erase Cliveden's political memory, but to place it within a broader interpretive framework, where contradictions are preserved rather than smoothed out. Part 8 of the Cliveden story thus focuses on the ethical question of memory. When a place once associated with decisions of great consequence is transformed into a space for sightseeing and contemplation, what is society's responsibility? Is it merely the preservation of physical things, or the preservation of the intellectual discomfort that the place once created? Cliveden forces one to confront the possibility that history lies not only in tragic events, but also in quiet drawing rooms, where consensus is formed without opposition. In this process of redefining, Cliveden becomes a crossroads between many different interpretations. To the traveler, it may be a retreat, a beautiful, iconic scene of classic England. To the researcher, it is a case study of power, class, and political responsibility. And to the broader collective memory, it is a reminder that great mistakes are sometimes made not by violence, but by a prolonged confidence in seemingly reasonable assumptions. As the 20th century drew to a close, Cliveden was no longer the center of public controversy, but it never became meaningless. Its silence now carries a different meaning, not the silence of influence, but the silence of reflection. It stands there as an open historical text, not imposing conclusions, but also not allowing the reader to skim through without pausing. Part 8 concludes at the point where Cliveden has completely detached himself from his role in shaping the present, yet never escaped the past. Its legacy lies not in whether it was once right or wrong, but in its exposure of a difficult truth, that in societies confident in their civilization, the most dangerous power is sometimes the power that does not need to claim itself, operating in beautiful and seemingly harmless spaces. Looking back at the entire journey of Cliveden House, what remains is not a simple moral judgment, but a long-term lesson about how power operates in societies that believe they have overcome the brutality of history. Cliveden was never the command center, never the place where treaties were signed or wars were declared. But precisely because of this, it becomes the perfect illustration of a more subtle, elusive, and accountable form of power, the power of shadowy consensus, of influence veiled by culture, education, and goodwill. The hidden price of Cliveden lies not in a single, identifiable decision, but in the accumulation of seemingly rational choices. Each delay to avoid confrontation, each belief that understanding would suffice to control ambition, each prioritizing the painful memories of the past over the warning signs of the present, all add up to a lost amount of time. History doesn't punish intentions, but it always records the consequences. And in this case, those consequences weren't caused by a single individual or a particular room, but by a mindset nurtured for too long in unchallenged spaces. What makes Cliveden's story important beyond its pre-war English context is its universality. In any society where power is concentrated in the hands of those confident they are acting in the common good, the greatest danger is not conspiracy, but collective complacency. Cliveden shows that grave historical mistakes can be made not by personal hatred or ambition, but by an overconfidence in assumptions that were true in another era. In the modern world, where democratic institutions are designed to make power transparent, Cliveden remains a valuable cautionary tale. It reminds us that transparency is not just a matter of law and procedure, but also a matter of the culture of debate. When major decisions are made within closed circles, however polite and intellectual they may appear, the likelihood of collective error increases exponentially. Not because those people are bad, but because they are too similar to see their own hidden flaws. The conclusion of this story is not intended to condemn a house or the people who have walked through it. Instead, it invites historical humility. Cliveden exists today as a beautiful heritage, but that beauty only truly has meaning when it is accompanied by the full memory of the tensions and conflicts that once unfolded within it. If history is only preserved in its easily visible form, it loses its most important function, the ability to make people uncomfortable long enough to think differently. After more than 3 centuries, Cliveden still stands there, looking down on the Thames as it always has. But what changes is not the perspective of the house, but the responsibility of those who look back at it. The hidden cost of Cliveden no longer lies in pre-war decisions, but in how subsequent generations choose to tell the story. Will it be told as an anecdote about the aristocracy, or as a lesson about the limits of caution and the danger of silence veiled in beauty? And it is at this point that the story of Cliveden concludes not with a definitive conclusion, but with an open question for all ages. When power chooses silence in safe and subtle spaces, who will speak on behalf of history before the price becomes irreversible? After the main story of Cliveden House concludes in the pre- and post-war pages of history, what remains is not absolute silence, but a lingering after-image. History, once it has passed through a space, rarely departs completely. It leaves behind invisible layers of sediment that continue to influence how people think about power, morality, and responsibility, even when the context has changed to the point of being unrecognizable. In the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, Cliveden no longer plays a central role in any political debate, But it is precisely this absence that makes it a particularly significant point of reference. Whenever British society, and more broadly, Western democracies, confront questions about behind-the-scenes influence, the role of unelected elites, or decisions made in the open, the name Cliveden is mentioned, not as a direct accusation, but as a cautionary memory. What makes Cliveden still so significant in modern thought is not what specifically happened, but the model it represents. A model where power needs no formality, no voting, no coercion, but operates through intimacy, through the belief that informed people can and should decide on behalf of the majority. That model did not disappear with the pre-war generation. It only changed form, adapting to the language and technology of each era. In today's world, these new Clivedens rarely take the form of country mansions. They exist in closed forums, networks of influence, spaces where politics, economics, and media intersect without always being subject to adequate oversight. The biggest difference is speed. What was once formed over long weekends at Cliveden can now appear in just hours, but the essence remains unchanged. Power is shaped by limited consensus. Part 10 of the Cliveden story, therefore, is not intended to prolong history, but to prolong the lesson. It raises the question of whether modern societies, with all the tools of transparency and checks and balances they possess, are truly immune to the mistakes once nurtured in spaces like Cliveden? Or are they simply repeating the same pattern, but in more subtle, harder to identify forms? One of the most important lessons from Cliveden is the danger of unchallenged consensus. When influential figures share the same background, values, and fears, the likelihood of them making the same mistakes increases significantly. This isn't because they lack information, but because they lack exposure to differing perspectives. Cliveden doesn't lack intelligence. It lacks the inconvenience of genuine critical thinking. In this context, the role of history is not to judge, but to create the necessary distance for reflection. Cliveden shows that goodwill alone is insufficient to guarantee the right outcome, and that caution, if not accompanied by timely action, can become a dangerous form of procrastination. These lessons are not unique to England, but are universal to any society that believes it has learned its lesson from the past. When visitors today walk through the halls of Cliveden, they see beauty, symmetry, and a sense of permanence. But the history of this place invites a deeper look, to see what was left unsaid, the decisions that were not made at the right time, and the assumptions that were once taken for granted. It is in these gaps that history truly operates. Part 10 concludes the entire journey not with a new conclusion, but with the continuation of an old question. Cliveden is no longer in power, but its story continues to resonate. It reminds us that in any age, when power feels too civilized to be dangerous, that is often when it is most dangerous. And that the responsibility of future generations is not just to preserve the stone walls, but to keep those unsettling questions being asked, even as history recedes into the distance. When the story of Cliveden House is placed at a sufficient distance from history, what emerges is no longer a series of pre-war or post-war events, but a structure of thought far more enduring than any stone house. It is the belief that power, when enveloped in culture, education, and goodwill, can be immune to error. Cliveden is not a place where power flaunts itself. It is a place where power reassures itself that it is doing the right thing. This part 11 does not seek to recount history further, but to touch upon a deeper level of the lesson. For what makes Cliveden memorable is not where it went wrong, but how certain it was that it could not go wrong. In those quiet drawing rooms, consensus was not formed by imposition, but by a sense of familiarity, by mutual trust among people who shared a common background and believed they understood the world well enough not to need to listen to voices outside their circle. The danger of this type of power lies in its lack of natural defense mechanisms. When violence is openly displayed, society tends to resist it. When power takes on a polite, intellectual, and measured appearance, it easily bypasses defenses. Cliveden demonstrates that history is not only bent by overt ambition, but also by the smooth confidence of those who believe they are acting for peace, stability, and the common good. In the modern world, that lesson remains relevant. Institutions may change, technologies may evolve, but the tendency to form consensus in closed spaces never disappears. Each era has its own Cliveden, not necessarily a physical location, but networks where power is exchanged informally, through jargon, and with the assumption that not everyone needs to be involved in major decision-making. Part 11 therefore poses a difficult demand to the viewer and reader, not to judge the past by the standards of the present, but to examine the present through the mirror of the past. Cliveden reminds us that good intentions are not a shield against consequences, and that caution, if not challenged by genuine criticism, can become a form of moral procrastination. As history moves forward, it does not ask whether we had good intentions. It simply records what happened when the opportunity to act existed. This extended ending does not seek to close the story with a comforting message. On the contrary, it retains the necessary unease. For it is precisely this unease that gives history meaning in the present. Cliveden is no longer influential, but the question it leaves behind remains quiet and persistent. When power feels itself civilized enough not to need questioning, who will dare to break that silence before the price becomes irreversible? And perhaps the greatest responsibility of future generations is not to draw conclusions for history, but to keep that question alive, even in the most beautiful spaces where power often believes it is safest.